Now, I want to make it clear right at the start that this isn't going to be a video where I create some type of imaginary scenario where Rey and Ahsoka do battle to see who would win in a fight. So if you've clicked on this video thinking that's what it's going to be, you have my apologies, and you can either stick around to see what it's actually about, or click away and continue on with your day. That being said, what I do want to talk about here is how these two characters were introduced into the Star Wars universe, initially received by the fans, and how they have progressed both in terms of their stories and fan reactions since. Mainly, I'm going to talk about how one of them, Ahsoka, went from one of the most controversial and hated characters amongst the fanbase to now one of the most beloved, while Rey started out as perhaps one of the most anticipated characters ever, to now being one of, if not almost certainly, the most debated and perhaps disliked character amongst fans. And let me just reiterate here that the keywords are by the fans. I'm not referring to how the general audience necessarily feels about these characters, since most average moviegoers probably don't even know who Ahsoka is, or care so much about the constant debate waged over Rey. Okay, now one of the things you may already be wondering is, why compare these two particular characters? Is it just because they're female characters? Well, not exactly, because their genders really shouldn't matter. The only thing that should matter is if they're good, well-developed characters. Unfortunately, especially in the case of Rey, and I'll get more into this later, her gender has been made an issue by Disney and Lucasfilm, and of course by some fans. There's also the fact that Star Wars, after its first two trilogies, was greatly lacking in the number of prominent or important female characters, with Leia and Padme being the only two real ones of note. And again, the gender of the characters really shouldn't matter. Nevertheless, it does feel a bit off to see so few female characters be significant to the overall story when you consider how vast the Star Wars galaxy is. That being said, you have to be careful about making characters just to fill a gap, if you will, and in this case, a gap in the number of female characters, or you're likely going to do more harm than good with the problem you're actually trying to solve. Characters should always have a true purpose for existing. They should feel like a natural and organic part of the story. And above all else, a character should serve the greater story in some respect, not the other way around, or like they've been placed there for a purpose that goes beyond just the story being told. And at first, Ahsoka felt like one of these completely unnecessary characters who was injected into a story just to try to lure in younger viewers, and in particular, younger girls. However, that wasn't entirely the case. Instead, George Lucas felt there was a need in the greater story to show how Anakin Skywalker went from the brash Padawan we saw throughout Episode 2 to the daring and more polished Jedi Knight we saw in Episode 3. And though we may have assumed Padme had a lot to do with this transformation, and probably did, we actually got to see it was more than that. It was also because he was, at first, burdened with the responsibility of a Padawan in a time of war, but eventually learned to trust and rely on that Padawan while, maybe not even realizing it, training her to be a great Jedi. Another thing Ahsoka did for us, the audience, was showcase Anakin's inability to let go, which would ultimately be his downfall. In other words, she served the greater story, had a real place and purpose, and one that felt natural, and for it all, became a great character on her own. And although I absolutely hated Ahsoka after seeing her for the first time in the Clone Wars animated movie, and not just because she was utterly annoying, but because I also didn't see the need for Anakin to have a Padawan. In fact, it was much like Anakin in the movie, who also didn't seem to see the need for him to have a Padawan, and thought there must be some kind of mistake. But something happened over the course of the next 5 seasons of the Clone Wars animated series. I found myself needing her in this story, just like Anakin found himself needing her in his own ways. And when Ahsoka walked away from Anakin and the Jedi Order in Season 5, it was heartbreaking to watch and is one of the most emotional moments in all of Star Wars. And now she has, for me, become such an integral part of his story that it's hard to imagine the character before this series anymore. It's hard to imagine Anakin Skywalker without Ahsoka Tano. But the truly impressive part is, Ahsoka is more than just a side note in the story of Anakin Skywalker. Somehow, she found a way to be more than just Anakin's apprentice, and also became very much her own character. And what was so great about her is, we could clearly and easily understand her motives, and hence relate to her. And they made sense for the character and the overall story. She mostly wanted to prove herself, and sometimes so much so that it cost her dearly. Like in the episode Storms Over Ryloth, where she disobeys Anakin and gets almost an entire squadron of clone pilots killed. And it almost seems odd to say, but what made her a great character is the fact that she failed almost as often as she succeeded, which made us, the audience, maybe without even realizing it, begin to root for her. and over time, she learned and grew from these mistakes. And the character we saw in Season 1 of the Clone Wars was not the same one we saw in Season 5, especially in the story arc where she was framed and had to go on the run to prove her innocence. And at the end of that arc, when she turned away from Anakin and the Jedi Order, we felt Anakin's pain and experienced a great deal of it ourselves. Then when the character returned in the show Rebels, we understood and believed who she was at this point in her life, and that she would be fighting for the early rebellion. In fact, I think it was this reintroduction that cemented her as one of the best, most well-developed characters in all of Star Wars, and took her popularity to new heights. And if you told me, back in 2008, after I'd just seen the Clone Wars movie for the first time, that one day she'd fight Vader and more or less hold her own, and that I'd be hoping she survives to live another day, I would have never believed you. That is a testament to just how impressive of a job they did in building this character. And then we move on to Rey, a character that we were told, long before we ever seen her on screen, would be a strong female character, and that she was essentially going to be the next great hero of Star Wars. While in contrast, and I could be wrong here, I'm not sure a big deal was ever made about the gender of Ahsoka leading up to the release of the Clone Wars movie. The big deal simply was Anakin was going to have a Padawan, and that seemed like a jarring concept and one a lot of people were unsure of. It had nothing to do with Ahsoka being a girl, and everything to do with the question, where was she in Episode 3, and why didn't Anakin ever mention her in that movie? And, in my opinion, telling us what they wanted Rey to become ahead of time was one of the dumbest and most off-putting things they could have done, because Rey, or any character, becoming beloved is something that has to be 100% earned, just like Ahsoka earned it. You can't tell me you're going to make a great, strong character. You have to show me. And now that you've told me what you want Rey to be, I'm going to find myself questioning every decision you make with this character because I know you have a clear goal in mind for her. In fact, I'd rather not be told you have any sort of agenda for her, in or out of the movies, because it completely undermines the potential growth and direction of the character, and tells me ahead of time what her ultimate fate is likely going to be. And no, none of this has anything to do with her being a female character. If you told me ahead of time they wanted Kylo Ren to be the next great villain, even better than Darth Vader, I would have said show me, don't tell me. And at the risk of sounding like a sexist pig here, which is not my intent, mind you, the least interesting aspect of her character thus far is the fact that she's a female character, because she feels almost asexual, which is probably their intent even. I mean, if Rey were a male character, and everything he did and said in these movies was kept the same as what the female Rey has said and done, would it feel any different or off to you? Sure, maybe some of his scenes with Kylo Ren might feel a bit different, especially the one from The Last Jedi when Rey basically blushes when she sees him shirtless. But overall, I dare say that no, if you made Rey a male character and kept everything else the same, it wouldn't feel off because it seems as if they've tried so very hard not to define Rey as just a woman, so much so that they've completely ignored that aspect of her character. And again, I probably sound like I'm being sexist here, but Rey is a woman. She doesn't have to be and shouldn't be just defined that way, but it should be a part of her character in some respect, or it just feels very unnatural. And then of course that leads us to the question, if Rey were indeed a male character, would people still be complaining about him? Simply put, yes they would. A lot of fans would be just as angry about things such as using a Jedi mind trick with no training, pulling a lightsaber out of the snow to him over Kylo Ren, and then defeating Kylo Ren in a lightsaber duel because he could simply close his eyes and let the Force in. They would also be upset and disappointed to learn that the explanation for all these powers was he simply is a counterbalance to Kylo Ren. And, unfortunately, Disney and Lucasfilm, and Kathleen Kennedy in particular, who can't get through an interview without saying strong female character at least once, has given the people who just call Rey a Mary Sue a leg to stand on because you've already said you're going to make Rey a strong character essentially because she's a woman, and because you failed to give her a good explanation for all these powers. And the funny thing is, or maybe the sad thing, is some of this anger people had over her unexplained abilities in The Force Awakens could have been mitigated had there been a better backstory and explanation for these powers given in The Last Jedi. Instead, Rian Johnson and company doubled down and just said she's powerful because the light side needed someone powerful to challenge Kylo Ren. And although, considering the Force seeks to be in balance, that does make sense, it at the same time just gives more ammunition to those who want to criticize this character. Now, you're probably getting the impression here that I'm a huge fan of Ahsoka and that I hate Rey. Whereas, yes, I am a huge fan of Ahsoka. I don't hate Rey. It's more disappointment that the new main protagonist in this sequel trilogy is so one-dimensional and has been given no clear motive after 2 movies, especially when you consider how brilliant and perfect I think her introduction was. Because with just a couple scenes at the start of The Force Awakens, I already felt how lonely she was and how self-reliant she was and had to be to survive on Jakku alone. Those scenes of her crawling around the massive empty Star Destroyer were visual representations of the level of isolation she no doubt felt on the inside, and it told us more about who and what this character was, or should have been, than any dialogue could have. She was someone completely alone in a giant galaxy, and had no one she could depend on or trust in a very precarious and dangerous situation, which living on Jakku no doubt is. This truly was a perfect start to a potentially great character. But it all went downhill from there, because I wish they would have played more on this theme of a feeling or need for total self-reliance because it was the only way she knew, without just making her completely self-reliant in every situation that arose for the rest of the movie. And they should have had her not trust Finn at all when they first met, which would have worked well with him being a stormtrooper and having something to hide from her, and had her be very reluctant to leave the planet not because she was waiting for her family, but because it was taking her 100% out of her comfort zone to not only leave, but to maybe have to rely on someone else because she would be in a completely foreign situation. And, oddly enough, learning to trust and rely on others was one of the lessons Ahsoka taught Anakin, but apparently one Rey didn't need to learn, because somehow after being self-reliant for so long on a desolate world where any and all resources were scarce, she was willing to immediately trust and befriend everyone she bumped into. Now, even though I disagree with the direction they initially took her character, and I didn't dislike Rey or have too much of an issue with her after The Force Awakens, despite what it probably sounds, I was willing to give her and the writers the benefit of the doubt that they were going to have her powers explained. But again, the only explanation we really got for her powers was darkness rises and light rises to meet it. That's it. And that might be fine if she was only shown to have tons of raw potential, but she was using actual learned skills like mind tricks and levitation, without any type of formal training like everyone else who has come before her has needed before performing such skills. And that just doesn't jive at all with the story that has come before it, and one can't help but hear Kathleen Kennedy saying strong female character in their heads when she moves an entire stack of giant boulders to liberate the trapped resistance at the end of The Last Jedi. And look, I'm not going to call Rey a Mary Sue. I'm just going to call her a poorly crafted character thus far, especially when you put her alongside a character like Ahsoka, who faced her own set of challenges when she was introduced into the Star Wars universe, but grew into a beloved character. And yes, you can certainly make the argument that Ahsoka had a lot more time to grow and develop when compared to Rey, considering Ahsoka had 5 seasons in a cartoon series to do it. But I've watched plenty of movies in my life where, in the span of just one movie, we've been introduced to a character and seen them grow and change into a different one by the end of that one movie. In fact, that's pretty much what every good movie accomplishes. Rey has now had 2 full movies, and I ask you this, what has she learned thus far? How has she grown as a character? What is her personal goal? Why does she suddenly want to be a Jedi, or does she even? I'm not sure I've actually heard her declare this as a desire. Why was she so hell-bent on saving Kylo Ren, to the point that she literally surrendered herself to try and do it? I mean, how did she really think that was going to play out? That she'd land on the First Order ship and Kylo Ren would say, okay, now let's get out of here. I mean, she had talked to him like 3 times over the course of one day and had that much faith in him to turn from the dark path? And remind me again how in the span of like 3 days, which is about the time period these 2 movies cover, how she went from someone who had lived her entire life alone, fending for herself on one of the harshest planets in the galaxy, to someone who would turn herself in and have faith in a guy that had, a couple days ago, murdered his father right in front of her. A guy that she had Force Skyped with for 3 times in the course of a day. I mean, was the Force bond created by Snoke so strong that it made her do something otherwise completely irrational to try and save him? If so, I hope this gets touched on, and maybe further played upon, in Episode 9. And no, I'm not trying to be an ass here. I'm being very serious. I'm trying to figure out who this character is and why does she do the things that she does. Rey had never left Jakku before, had never been in any type of different setting, yet she not only takes everything in stride, but easily adapts and overcomes each and every challenge she faces. This does not make for an interesting character. Hell, Finn seemed far more disoriented than her, and he's no doubt been to many different places in the galaxy and has received some type of education from the First Order, I'd imagine. And why does Rey trust everyone she runs into? Because when you really think about it, she should have some serious trust issues, considering her parents abandoned her, and most of the others we see living on Jakku with her are clearly not good people. But the real problem right now is, when Rey stands victorious at the end of Episode 9, will we cheer for her or just roll our eyes? How will her overall journey compare to the one Ahsoka took, where she started off as this annoying brat who constantly thought she could do better and knew better than Anakin, oftentimes with drastic consequences, before she came into her own and had the courage to walk away from everything she had once known when she abandoned Anakin and the Jedi Order? Will we be on the edge of our seats with worry when Rey has her final battle with Kylo Ren, like we were with Ahsoka battling Vader, or will we just not care because we know Rey's going to win? And therein lies the greatest problem with Rey. I don't believe the powers that be at Disney and Lucasfilm will let her fail, because they've basically said from the start that she's not going to. And that's a problem because what should dictate the final outcome of this character is not what they want her to be or represent, but what makes for the best possible story. And even though I am all for more female characters in Star Wars, until we get more like Ahsoka and less like Rey, Star Wars is not going to be a place for truly inspiring stories and characters. It's going to be a place where we're told ahead of time how we should think and feel about a character, and if we dare disagree, it's because we're against strong female characters, not because, in reality, we're just against poorly crafted ones with agendas outside of the movies. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. How do you feel about Ahsoka when she was first introduced, and how do you feel about her now? And what do you think about Rey? Have you been okay with her story thus far, or do you think they've missed the mark with her? Let me know in the comments below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.